A door that was never meant to open taught me how silence is enforced. It does not hold wine. It holds the room's intention. Continuity seduces. Correction intoxicates.
They don't praise. They tune.
We moved a feast. The city breathed easier.
Sympathy does what decree cannot.
Mercy is friction with manners.
I did not enter the priesthood because I loved certainty. I entered because I feared chaos, and the collar promised an alphabet for the inarticulate parts of me: sorrow, hunger, awe, letters I could hold to my chest until they warmed. I was a diligent student of obedience. I practiced the small disciplines, rising before dawn, cataloging my errors at night in a square hand, memorizing the hours so thoroughly that my pulse sometimes quickened on the quarter, even when no bell rang. For 14 years, I understood myself as a keeper of continuity. There was comfort in repetition: bread raised, wine lifted, names recited in a cadence that had outlived empires. When I was assigned to the archives, I felt chosen in the least glamorous, most dangerous way a faithful man can be chosen, to tend the places where memory stops being story and hardens into law. The first time I descended, the lamplight revealed dust turning over itself like a slow constellation. The staircase was narrow enough that I had to walk sideways. My shoulder brushed cold stone where innumerable shoulders must have brushed before. I counted the lamps along the corridor: 13, then tried to pretend I had not counted them. 13 is an accident only to people who never had to make a decision about whether the arrangement of the world should look accidental. I remember the smell more than the sight. Old tallow, parchment that had been rained on once, dried and kept the memory of iron in its fibers. Chalk. A sweetness like apple peel, faint and wrong, the ghost of some votive oil rubbed into wood a century ago. I breathed carefully, the way you breathe near sleeping animals. Take this one first. The archivist's voice sounded like pages turning. He was a careful, withered man whose posture had been trained by a lifetime of not disturbing dust. He handed me a folio with chain bindings, black iron rings that made the paper look married to the table. You will copy the permissible sections. And if you are uncertain what is permissible, you will ask, "What if I am uncertain whether I am uncertain?" I meant it as a small joke. He didn't. "Then you are not permitted," he said, and placed a key on the table with 2 crossed teeth and a small sun cut into its bow. The sun was eclipsed. Only the ring of it showed. There is a threshold in every vocation where duty stops feeling like service and starts feeling like theater. Down there, the stage was stone. I watched my hands for the first weeks. The way I held the pen, the careful angle of the nib, the way the light pooled around the letters as I pulled them from silence. Language is a form of agriculture. You plow the line and plant a mark and hope it will feed someone. The ledgers were gentle lies stitched to dangerous truths. I copied miracle accounts with marginalia that scolded their authors for excessive wonder. I transcribed letters between clerics who had disagreed privately and agreed publicly, each convinced he was safeguarding a fragile flock. Where centuries had rubbed together, the friction made heat. A note would appear in a later hand, square and exact. Resequence the feast. Once, only once, a bolder instruction appeared like a knife laid flat. Remove him. Below, a later librarian had added, in a pale gray, done. I learned quickly the geography of omission. Gaps have a shape. An absent paragraph leaves a tensile silence. The way a missing tooth changes not just the smile but the entire tongue's grammar. I learned to hear what had been kept out. I learned the sound of a redaction by how the words on either side leaned toward each other, eager to pretend they had always belonged. The archivist tested me with innocuous documents, and then, by degrees, less innocuous ones. He watched my face the way physicians watch a patient's breath for changes too small to count as symptoms. I practiced serenity. I failed at it often enough to be honest. Serenity down there felt like a posture rather than a virtue, and postures grow heavy with time. Do you believe time is a ladder or a loop? He asked me one afternoon as we compared festal lists from the same diocese printed 81 years apart. 3 saints had been promoted to days and then quietly demoted to the margins. A local martyr's feast had migrated across the month like a refugee. Neither, I said. Time is a book we are not finished learning to read. He grunted, which was as close as he came to praise. In the 3rd week, I was invited to an inner room. This is how such things happen not by thunder, but by habit. You are offered a stool closer to the table, a better lamp, a question that feels like a courtesy and later turns out to have been a key. The door was plain metal, worn smooth by palms. On it, etched so fine, I had to fog the surface with my breath to see it, was a Latin line, non cantabit nisi cavum. It will not sing unless it is hollow. Some phrases enter you like blades, and some like splinters. This one felt like a splinter that knew it was also a map. I rubbed my thumb over the letters until they were warmer than the door. The archivist watched without blinking. Translate, he said. It will not sing unless it is hollow. I kept my voice level, but the back of my neck had become a nerve. What will not sing? He asked. I don't know, I said, and hated the way the honesty felt like disobedience. Good, he murmured. Keep not knowing until you are ready to confess the knowing. If you have never learned to keep a secret on behalf of people you love, you may not understand how secrets can feel like a sacrament. The keeping becomes an offering. Down there, offerings accumulated in boxes and rings and marginal notes that hope to outlive their makers. I started to dream in the handwriting of men dead longer than the roads above us had been paved. In my sleep, I brushed my hand over vellum and left a print of heat that bled through to the next page. There are moments I can date precisely by the way light shocked the room. One afternoon, a cloud opened like a door and a straight white blade came down the stairwell, cutting across the table and turning the chain-link silver. The archivist slid a wooden object onto the surface where the light fell. He did not name it. He did not have to. It was not the thing itself later. Other things would demand more attention, but the way the light refused it that startled me. It sat in brightness the way a stone sits in a river surrounded by motion, unchanged by it. The room seemed to hum, with the effort of pretending nothing new had entered. Catalog entry, he said. What shall I call it? I asked. Call it whatever you can say without writing it down, he said, and the way he said it told me that names, like time, are agreements more than facts. I wrote a description instead. Bowl, deep, composition unknown, surface optical behavior inconsistent with ambient light, rim irregular, inlays pale. I tried not to say teeth. If I wrote teeth, I would have to ask whose. It is not for you yet, he said, and carried the object away into the kind of darkness you cannot name without inviting a second darkness to come inspect your courage. If I am drawing this out, it is because the sequence matters. We think revelations arrive like thunderclaps. In my experience, they arrive like addresses you pass every day on the bus. Until one morning you realize the house you thought was blue is the same color as your own fear. The mind is a patient locksmith, the heart less so. Another week and I was introduced to the calendar corrections, not the public ones everyone knows about, Julian and Gregorian, the neat little arithmetic of leap days made to keep Easter from wandering like a pilgrim without a guide. These were subtler and more domestic changes, the kind mothers make to keep small children from asking questions at the table. Little switches of schedule, a feast moved 3 days, so that it would not coincide with a troublesome harvest superstition. A fast expanded to cover a week when a comet had frightened companionable minds. In the margins, a note again, resequence. Then, conform. There is no villainy in tidying, not at first. Change one bell and you save a town from tripping over its prayers. Change 2 bells and you save a bishop a letter he does not have time to write. Change 3, and the chime you hear in your sleep matches the rhythm of the men who own your mornings. Does it trouble you? The archivist asked, without looking up from his own column of neat square letters. It would trouble me if no one had ever done it, I said. But someone has to watch the windows when the weather changes. He made the sound he made when my answer was not wrong enough to constitute a moral flaw, nor right enough to be filed as wisdom. Keep copying, he said. There is a discipline in copying that I recommend to anyone who has begun to suspect his faith is a costume. Copy long enough, and you will see where a sentence's hem was tucked, where the tailor let out a seam to fit a different torso. I learned to detect tremor by its absence. I learned to see edits that had been prayed over. The ones prayed over are cleaner, they do not smudge. But the ones done in a hurry have fingerprints. Ink is honest about haste. The phrase returned, non cantabit nisi cavum. It appeared on an index card, laid like a talisman on a stack of measurements. The card did not belong to the stack. Its edges were older, and it had been written with a nib that splayed in a way none of our present pens did. The measurements themselves looked like an argument between music and engineering numbers in regular rows, interrupted by tiny sketches of circles and ovals. I recognized the shapes from the stonework above ground, cavities in domes, cunning voids inside pillars, pockets of air where a mason had left breath to lighten weight. A cathedral is a choreography of emptiness. The stone is a way to carry the air where we want it to sing. What does it mean? I asked, tapping the edge of the card. It means we have been slow to learn what our ancestors learned by building, and quick to forget what they knew, because we learned it by writing. He drew a circle with a fingertip on the table, a slow wedding ring, without a ceremony. It means you cannot make a song in a solid. You must hollow something first. A flute, a throat, a century, I said, tasting the word the way a sommelier tastes a warning. He did not answer, but later that evening he placed 2 festal lists side by side again, a newer one and an older, and this time the difference was bolder than before. A patron's day erased, a name replaced by a title. The air over the pages felt busier, as if the lists themselves were rehearsing a new arrangement of their bodies. "Do you know about phantom time?" he asked. "I know the phrase," I said cautiously. "A speculation. Historians who believe centuries were invented. Kings who manufactured ancestor dust to breathe." He shrugged in a way that made it unclear whether shrugging was agreement or courtship. Speculation is a word people use when they realize they arrived at the question after someone else asked it. Continue copying. I did, and in copying, I learned the order of operations. You do not erase years the way one erases a chalkboard. You shape the space around them so that the mind's tongue no longer finds where the missing tooth once lived. You move feasts. You rename patrons. You restrict liturgies whose melodies might accidentally align with old star charts. You insist on new processions through old streets so that the foot forgets the slope it used to recognize in the dark. You do not remove the stair. You add a riser until the climb feels natural. Night after night, returning to my cell, I found my hearing altered. Silence had weight and articulation. It had hinges. Doors do not open only in walls. They open in minutes. I would enter my room at 23:07, and the air would be a room. I would cross to the small window that looked like a slit in a stone lid, and at 23:09, the air would be another room, one I recognized but whose furniture had been quietly replaced. If this sounds mad, it is because you have not kept time for other people and then discovered time keeping you. We take for granted that hours are bowls we fill and set upon the table. Down there, I learned that hours can be bowls someone else empties when we look away. A month into my service, the archivist handed me a narrow ledger with a spine so worn the leather remembered fingerprints discoverable only by a lamp held at a certain shrewd tilt. The first line was a name I did not recognize. The second was a title I recognized too well. Missa Emendationis, the Mass of Correction. My gut, trained by trivial superstitions and large ones both, practiced the old reflex, cross yourself, defer, cough the concern into the cloak of prayer. I did none of those things. I read. There were notations of dates that corresponded to eclipses. There were locations in a shorthand I recognized as a mapmaker's triangles of reference, circles of radius written like breaths. The language of the rite itself was older than Latin in the way gravity is older than apples. Hard to speak without opening something that would demand to be closed behind you. Copy the rubrics only, the archivist said. Leave the invocations. They are not for paper. Are they for the tongue? I asked. They are for the air, he said, and the air is a jealous scribe. You must understand how ordinary the days were between these provocations. We drank simple coffee that tasted like small penances. We argued kindly about the proper size of a margin. We mocked gently the excesses of bishops who annotated in purple because black bored them. I took comfort in the pettiness of our profession. Men who move centuries, one feast at a time, still worry about ink costs, but the phrase in the door kept finding me. It is a mercy and a cruelty when a short sentence becomes your weather. It will not sing unless it is hollow. The first object of the verb changes depending on the hour. Sometimes it is the vault above an altar. Sometimes it is the year that refused to hold a comet. Sometimes it is me. I have put off telling you the night I opened the door because I am tempted to say I was compelled, which would comfort me and absolve me both. The truth is smaller and uglier. I was curious in a way disciplined men pretend they are not. I was tired of being not yet initiated. I was proud and wanted my pride rebuked by initiation. No thunderclap, no accident. The archivist had left early. The room felt like a church after a wedding petals on the floor, a silence that does not know what to do with its hands. The key was where it always was, on the hook behind the gray cupboard. It was heavy, which I had noticed before. Tonight it was heavier. I told myself the heaviness was metaphor and kept going. The teeth slid into the metal like an old conversation picking up where it had faltered. The lock's inhale was small but rude. When the door swung, the lamplight did not move into the space beyond. It stayed behind me, a loyal dog refusing an unfamiliar room. I do not have the words to describe the smell. I will try plain ones. Iron. Stone that has been rained on and kept the rain. A dark sweetness that reminded me of fruit that refuses to rot. The temperature dropped 6 careful degrees. The darkness was not absolute. It was textured, like velvet used too long. I took 3 steps, and the sound of my breath changed shape. The room was larger than the lamp approved of. "Hello," I said, because men are stupid about rehearsing bravery. When I set the lamp on the floor, there, on a table that looked grown from the rock and not placed upon it, was the bowl again, the one the light had not liked. It drank the lamp in small, patient swallows. Around its rim, the pale inlays, there were 13, caught the thin light and made a crown of uneven stars. My mouth said teeth without consulting me. I felt the heat rise in my face, shame at naming what I had been trained to leave unnamed until someone richer than me allowed it. There are myths about cups. We store wishes and origin stories in them. We imagine they collect tears, blood, hope. We drink from them to belong to one another. This cup did not ask to be imagined. It behaved like an instrument, pretending to be a vessel. The nearer I brought my ear, the more the air thickened. Not a sound. The suggestion of a pressure that would become sound if given permission. A song that required hollowness to be heard. On the wall behind the table, drawn with a patience that made me want to apologize for everything I had ever done quickly, was a sequence of circles. Not perfect. Perfect circles are brutal, but practiced. Within and around them were marks I recognized as notations from men who had learned astronomy the way a widow learns the seasons by watching. Here and there a word in Latin, Greek, something older. The only line that stood nearly new was the same one as on the door. Non cantabit nisi cavum. My hand, without me, traced one circle's outline and stopped at a notch carved like a fingernail mark. The notch corresponded to a date in the ledger I had recopied earlier that day, an eclipse recorded as partial in Rome, total in a place that could be reached only by ships whose names had been rubbed out. I realized the arrangements on the wall were not decorative, but operational. The room was a body, and somebody who had trusted the future had laid out the organs for an untrained surgeon. I did not touch the bowl. This is where I want to insist on my restraint. I did not touch the bowl. I put both hands behind my back, like a novice at his first altar, and listed saints I was not certain existed out loud. The bowl did not change its mind about me. The void inside it stayed void. There were papers stacked near the table's edge, thin onion skin sheets covered in a hand so small it looked like disobedience. At the top of the nearest page, choir response frequencies. Beneath a line that could have been lyric or instruction, They sing from cavities, from any shape built to carry absence. Then, measurements. Then, underlined, a choir is not a congregation. It is a tool. I stepped back so fast, the lamp trembled, and the room made that old gesture men mistake for a warning. The air moving like a hand, not wanting to startle a skittish animal. Enough, I said to myself, which is what you say when you want to hear a voice. I took the lamp and the key and closed the door and stood there while the lock relearned its vow. The corridor's ordinary gloom hit me like weather. I placed the key back on its hook, with a care that would have looked like piety to anyone watching. No one was. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back and listened to the building talk to its own weight. In the way a heartbeat becomes a clock when you decide to hear it, the silence became articulated. This is the part I hesitate to write, because it brands me as the kind of narrator I used to pity, unreliable by being too diligent in his impressions. But we are the sum of our hearings, and what I heard was not a choir. It was the shape a choir would need in order to fit into a room not designed for music. In the morning, the archivist did not look at me with suspicion or triumph. He handed me a cup of coffee and a stack of small, dull tasks, pagination checks, ink inventories, a minor scandal involving a misfiled reliquary schedule that meant a finger bone might have been kissed by the wrong town. The ordinary world is a net God throws across our panic. I breathed into it and let it hold me a while. Around noon, unceremoniously, he set the narrow ledger back on my table. "You may copy the rubrics," he said again, "and when you are ready to not copy them, you will tell me so." He said no then. "What if I tell you I am never ready?" I said. "Then you will be safer than most," he said. "But not safe. There is no safe down here, reader. There is only more or less visible. I chose to be less visible for 3 more days. I copied the rubrics like an obedient mechanic who has never learned to drive. I mapped the sequence of gestures and the arrangement of objects and the posture of the mouth, even when the mouth was not permitted to pronounce. A bowl is placed at the center. The chamber must be shaped to receive. A void must be acknowledged. The reader must be of steady hands and unsteady heart. That last line was not, I think, official. Late on the 4th night, the archivist finally asked the question he had been making for weeks. "Do you believe silence is sacred?" I answered quickly, because I had prepared. "Silence is an instrument." "Whose?" he asked. "Whichever hand learns to hold it without feeling holy," I said. The words surprised me. They tasted like a door. He nodded once, which in his language meant, "You are already more inside than is good for you." He closed his ledger and stood with the reluctance of old men. "Come," he said, without ceremony and without threat. We did not go to the door. We went to an antechamber I had misjudged as storage. He lifted a tarpaulin and revealed a slab of slate, scratched with chalk in a grammar the mathematicians upstairs would have called elegant. It looked like a night sky that had been taught manners, points connected into triangles, arcs that noted distances I could feel in my knees. At the center, a circle, and within it, a smaller circle, and within that a simple bowl shape a child might have drawn to describe his mother's hunger. "It is not only priests who tune the world," he said. "It is buildings. It is bowls. It is the way we teach children to end a story." "And when the story will not end?" I asked. "Because I am a coward, and bravery in such rooms often expresses itself as platitude." Then we build a hollow for the echo, he said, and smiled once, a quick eclipse I might have missed if I had not learned to watch the edges of things. I have been delaying the smallest part of my confession because it embarrasses me. It is a cliché, and men like me distrust clichés the way surgeons distrust folklore. That night, while I lay awake, I prayed. Not the tidy office I had learned to pray to keep my duties aligned, but the other prayer, the one that drafts you in as witness against yourself. I asked for the courage to tell the truth when I recognized it, and for the mercy to know when the truth was not mine to tell. I asked for the safety of those who had trusted me with their dust. I asked to be given a door that was not a test. In the morning, the archivist did not look transfigured by my petition. He looked like an old man whose coffee had been brewed too long ago. He pushed a small envelope across the table. In it, a card with the line again, printed in the same square, exact hand that had perfected my own. Non cantabit nisi cavum. On the back, in a younger hand, a note. You will be asked to choose between song and substance. If you choose song, remember that it was born from a hollow. If you choose substance, remember that it is mostly hollow already. 6 weeks after my first descent, I knew the roots blind. I could count 13 lamps by sound alone, the soft complaint of oil adjusting to air. I could put my hand on the metal door and tell whether the room behind it was holding its breath or exhaling. And yet, for all my new confidences, I remained the same stupid animal who opened the door because he wanted to stop wondering. You may ask why I stayed. You may ask why any of us stay anywhere we sense the geometry of our conscience being measured for its hollows. The answers are mean and practical. I had nowhere else to go that would have me. I had believed too long in the dignity of my work to concede it to a younger man without seeing what it was made of. And, secretly, I wanted to catch the lie that would let me leave and claim I had been forced. The lie did not present itself. Instead, there were 1,000 small truths, too heavy to carry upstairs, and too light to justify a protest. The last page I copied before the night that changed the slope of my life contained a line that should have been unremarkable. Adjust the procession to avoid echo. I stared at the word until it ceased to belong to language. Echo. We think of it as playful, a child's game in a canyon. Down there it revealed its technical aspect. Echo is not repetition. Echo is evidence of a hollow. It is the world teaching you how it has been made. When I finally slept, I dreamed I was walking a corridor that narrowed so slowly I could not say when I began to notice it. At the end there was a room that was both full and empty, like a heart freshly broken and thrilled to be useful again. In the center was the bowl. Instead of teeth, the rim had been inlaid with small white stones smoothed by rivers I had never visited. I placed the bowl to my ear the way a child places a shell, expecting the sea. The sound that arrived was not water but pages turning in heavy sleep. I woke with the certainty that there is a door in every sentence, and if you lean hard enough against the hinge, you can hear the hallway behind it. I dressed. I went down. I counted the lamps. The key was heavier than ever, and the lock inhaled, as if I were feeding it. When the door opened, the lamp once again refused the room. It clung to my hand like a child who will not cross a threshold. I entered anyway. I will not say what I saw then. Not yet. A confession is a ladder. If I force you up 3 rungs at once, you will fall and call me a liar to save your pride. What matters for now is simple. Rooms can be tuned. Years can be tuned. Men can be tuned, and a bowl can remind the air to become a choir if the hollows are arranged with sufficient humility and cruelty. I learned that humility and cruelty are closer cousins than I had been told. I returned to my table. I copied steady lines with a hand that in no way betrayed the tremor of my marrow. The archivist watched the air above me the way a farmer watches a sky that is deciding whether to forgive. He placed a second key beside my elbow. The bow bore a sun not eclipsed, but drawn as if recovering from it. "You will need this soon," he said. "It opens the door inside the door." In the sum, "There is always a door inside the door," I said, "because in the presence of ravines we practice wit." He did not smile. "Only when someone has learned how to make a hollow inside a hollow," he said. Then he added, "After the manner of men who cannot help themselves, do not be heroic. Heroism is a song. We have enough songs." That night, I wrote nothing in my notebook. I lay my pen down and stared at the ceiling, which had been built by men who understood that even flatness benefits from a little curve. I listened for the choir that was not a choir, and when I heard nothing but the ordinary breath of stone, I felt an emotion I will name without shame: disappointment. That is when the danger began, not with horror, but with the hunger for it. Outside, somewhere, a bell miscounted. The sound came through my small window as if a throat were pressed to it. 3, 4, 6. Then, the silence, the articulated kind, the one with hinges. I slept. I did not dream. In the morning, I woke with a sentence whole and unforgiving in my mouth. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. I spoke it aloud into the basin where I washed my face, and watched the water hold my breath for a second before forgetting me. "You asked for confession. This is mine." I knew the door should remain closed and opened it anyway. I knew my calling was to preserve, and I learned to edit. I knew that the world we offer the faithful depends upon minor adjustments made with steady hands and unsteady hearts, and I kept my hands steady and my heart more so. In a different version of me, I would have stopped here, arrested by shame and the ordinary cowardice of decent men. In this version, I kept walking. Above us, the city went about its patient corruptions and its generous kindnesses. People lined up for pastry. Tourists mispronounced beauty and took photographs of the forgiveness they hoped to deserve someday. A river remembered its curve through the old empire like a scar that has forgiven its knife. Below, we turned the pages of time with clean fingers and did not entirely lie to ourselves about why. If the world is a book, someone must be allowed to edit, or else the margins will grow until the ink has no place to stand. That is the argument we made. That is the argument I believed until the night I heard the hollow sing. The thing about relics is that faith teaches you to approach them with choreography. There is a correct angle to the gaze, a correct slowness of the hands, a correct equilibrium between fear and usefulness. Objects acquire liturgy. Even candles learn where to pool their wax. When I say the bowl no, the Grail refused the lamplight, I do not mean merely that it was dark. I mean it edited brightness, pressed it down, thinned it into a kind of obedient dusk. A lesser man would have called it trickery. A better man might have called it physics. I was neither. I called it by the sensation it stirred in my ribs: recognition. The archivist did not summon me to it. He never did. That would have made the encounter too declarative, and nothing down there liked declarations. The Grail appeared the way weather appears by degree, by rumor, by the way the door knew when my knuckles were near. I learned to arrive with my breath already lowered, as if I were entering a nursery where sleep was a sacrament, and the slightest exhale might undo an infant's fragile contract with dreams. Obsidian, they would say upstairs, in the language of gift shops. Volcanic glass, a miracle of pressure and temper, but the Grail could not be reduced to stone. Stone receives, this thing initiated. When I brought the lamp to a respectful proximity, its surface behaved as if it remembered a sky I had never seen. Light didn't land. It negotiated, it skimmed, it pooled in a lip-thin shimmer that made the rim look wet. Around that rim, 13 pale inserts, irregular as if a jeweler had worked with a trembling hand or with a material that refused milling. Teeth, I had said once when the word stole past my better judgment, and I regretted it the way a novice regrets his first imprecise homily. But a word wants custody of a thing once spoken. From that moment, the rim sang in my imagination, even when my ears heard nothing. Teeth belong to mouths. Mouths imply breath. Breath implies song. You are leaning, the archivist said the second afternoon I stood too long, watching the bowl erase the lamp's conviction. He spoke without accusation, as one points out a posture that might lead to a cramp. Lean with the spine, not the head. Let your head keep its distance. There are measurements, I said, nodding at the chalk arcs sketched on the slate slab like constellations that had learned to obey corridors. Radiuses, angles, times. Times, there are always measurements, he said. They are the cords we tie around chaos, so we can lead it into a room without insulting it. Do not confuse the cord for the animal. What is the animal? I asked. He moved the lamp 2 inches left, and the room's hum changed key, almost barely in the margins of perception. Listen, he said, not to me but to the air. It remembers. I pretended not to understand that I had just been taught the first rule of the Grail. It was an instrument that played the chamber before it played us. The ledger labeled Calyx Umbrae did not offer mythology. It offered logistics, a list of eclipses, partial and total, annotated with weather, attendance, the names of priests who were allowed to watch, and the names of clerks who were allowed to pretend they had not. The entries read like a ship's log, kept by a captain who distrusted water. Clouds rolled at the 8th minute, resonance reduced to a tremble. Candle stubs replaced with newly blessed tapers. Bloom improved. Bell in the north stairwell, muted with felt. No false harmonics. The more I copied, the more I heard the language of music, elbowing the language of worship out of the way. We were not adoring. We were tuning. Why 13 inlays? I asked one evening, when the bowl's lip glowed like the last line of a dying horizon. Because 12 is a clock, he said, and clocks are for the public face of time. And 13 is for the back of the clock, he said, and I liked and hated how quickly he answered. I was permitted, by then, to read the older hands without supervision, the ones who had risked adjectives. The Grail does not hold wine. It holds what the air cannot admit it knows how to carry. The resonance gathers quickest when something above is briefly stolen from the sky. The choir arrives from the outlines of emptiness. Mouths of statues, flutes of stairs, throats of tombs. Every line wanted a witness. Every witness wanted to be anonymous. Even the ink looked furtive, iron gall that dried with the color of a bruise you are not ready to explain. Once, bold beyond his station, a young hand had drawn a cross-section of the basilica, slicing it open like a fruit to reveal its chambers. He highlighted cavities, a resonant loft above a transept, a thin-walled conduit behind an altar, the hollow rib of a great column, and circled them with a gentle insistence. They sing because they are hollow. Under it, in a more patient script, someone had added, "We built instruments and called them churches." It should have made me angry. I wanted to be offended on behalf of a god whose houses had been labeled tools, but offense requires certainty, and certainty had begun to erode in me the way sandstone erodes grain by grain, with a beauty that shames the onlooker. My training had not prepared me for a sacrament that was also a machine. On a Tuesday of no particular liturgical interest, the archivist asked me to carry the Grail. "You will not," I said, and was embarrassed by my swiftness. "You will," he said, and placed my hands where his had been, one under, one steadying the lip. It weighed less than I feared and more than I hoped. Not enough to hurt, enough to persuade my wrist to honesty. The surface was cool, in a way that did not belong to the room. The hollowness inside it had a temperature. It felt like the inside of a word spoken in a crypt. "Where to?" I asked. He gestured toward the slate slab marked with circles and notations. A chalk outline matched the bowl's footprint by fate or fidelity. I lowered it until the outline and object married. A low change in the room's breath announced the union. The archivist tilted the lamp, then pinched its flame closed with two practiced fingers. The dark was not absolute. It had texture, like a theater before a curtain learns to lift. "There," he said. "Now we can listen without the lamp's vanity." It began as pressure more than tone, not inside the ear but just south of it, where the jaw learns who you are when you lie. Then, slowly, like a memory approaching from childhood without knowing why it has returned, a sustained hum arrived. It was not pretty. It was exact. The hum discovered the walls and tried on their lozenges and hollows, then tried on my ribs, then found a narrow throat in the far corner where a vent climbed to a corridor I had never mapped. The archivist raised a palm to hush nothing, and the room, obedient, obliged. "Do you hear the choir?" he asked. "I hear air specializing," I said, and hated my metaphor but kept it. He nodded. "We always want angels to sing to us. It flatters us into thinking the message has a face. But what you are hearing is instruction. The room instructing itself to remember its voids." "Instruction from what?" I asked. He touched the rim's nearest inset with a fingertip that refused to shake. "From whatever these belonged to," he said. "Teeth," I said, and the room felt smaller. He did not dignify my fear with sympathy. "Relics are shorthand. We gather pieces of the unfinishable and pretend custody makes us custodians. What matters is that mouths have laws, teeth know those laws. The rim keeps the law where the air can borrow it." "You speak like an engineer," I said. "I speak like a penitent," he said. "Penitents spend their lives learning which hollows to confess into, so that the echo comes back changed." We listened. The sound did not grow louder. It grew more articulate. There were troughs in it, valleys where a human voice would naturally settle if it wanted to remain hidden inside a longer tone. There were cusps, too, where the hum sharpened as if testing whether the room would cooperate. Somewhere above, a tourist laughed, and the laugh arrived through cracks in the stone, as flour arrives through a sieve. What was coarse stayed behind. What was fine entered and became part of the dough. What happens at an eclipse? I asked. The ledger left too many nouns unsupervised. The sky performs subtraction, he said, and subtraction is the purest prayer. We borrow the sky's good manners for a few minutes. The bowl fills. With what? Not sound, he said. The capacity for sound. The recipe. The room becomes fluent in itself. The choir, I said. The instruction, he corrected, and I heard the catechism his correction contained. He let me place my palm above the bowl without touching it, like a faithful man testing warmth above a radiator on a winter morning. The air just above the lip had density, a thin reluctance. If I moved my hand too quickly, the density resisted, as if I were trying to wade through a lake made of very patient breath. I imagined lungs, then forbid myself the image. Who made it? I asked, because questions are how fear tries to make itself useful. The bowl? His mouth considered a smile and then refused it. People who were better at stopping than we are. Stopping what? Voices, he said. History. The urge to finish. I laughed, because the alternative was an argument with a silence that could not sign consent forms. And the teeth? He looked at me then with a pity I had not earned. Where do you think songs begin? In the prettiness or in the bite? He tapped the rim once with his nail. A soft, terribly exact ping answered. The room arranged itself around it, geometry in the act of remembering its lines. We spent days in exercises that would have bored any witness who did not know boredom is a veil. Move the bowl a hair clockwise. Note the difference. Shift a felt baffle into the north vent. Note the difference. Drape linen over the reliquary frames. Note the difference. We were teaching the room to become generic so we could measure the specific. When it had learned not to surprise us, we let it surprise us again. In the ledger, I wrote what I had been trained to write. Quanta of change, distance, time, temperature, the color of the candle stubs as they diminished. But beside those neat columns, my hand betrayed me and wrote a private column. The room felt like a forehead cooling after fever. The hum's second harmonic arrived sooner when I prayed without moving my lips. When I thought of oceans, the pressure behind my ear deepened as if pulling tide through bone. The archivist pretended not to notice my thefts. Perhaps he knew there is no clean experiment that involves breath. Perhaps he was amused that I had reached the edge of my vocabulary and was trying to grow it a scaffolding. In the 5th week of my acquaintance with the Grail, we were granted an alignment, not a full eclipse, but a rehearsal. Heaven offers men who cannot be trusted with finales. Clouds were benign. The city above us had grown quiet, for reasons that had nothing to do with liturgy and everything to do with heat. The slate slab bristled with chalk in small essential equations. The bowl sat in its circle like a lake, trying not to admit the moon. We extinguished the lamps, and the room adopted its working darkness. I have been careful not to be dramatic because drama is an addictive salt. But if a reader will forgive one handful, the air that day gathered. It gathered in the way people gather before a beloved door. Opens the shuffle, quiets. The elbows learn courtesy. The breath sits down. A tremble passed through stone the way an apology passes through a house when a father finally speaks it. The bowl did not fill. The bowl allowed. Its interior took on depth that was not visual. It felt farther away than it was. The hum lengthened. The harmonics, no longer ashamed of their arithmetic, stood up from the floor like columns that had been there all along but needed permission to reveal their posture. I heard them then. Not words, never words. A layered instruction, a hum, and inside it a narrow corridor of lower hum, and inside that a thinner, nearly silent thread, where my own pulse took its cue and slowed. From the mouths of statues, stone throats that had been hollowed to save weight, and, it seems, to save something else, a steadier presence joined. Not loud, assertive the way gravity is assertive. In the vents, a high whisper stiffened as linen does when it dries on a line. Every hollow in the room admitted it knew what it was for. I whispered angels because I was weak and wanted the consolation of a noun that smiled. The archivist, who had not asked permission from the darkness to move, said nothing, and in his silence I heard the only education that mattered, an agreement to let the room be smarter than us. When the sky above us returned the sun to itself, the room exhaled in stages. The bowl shallowed. The hum unfurled and lay down. I realized I had been bracing my knees as if adjusting to a boat's slow pitch. The archivist relit the lamp with a tinder that had memorized his hands. He looked older in the small brightness and also younger, as if the hum had sanded a few unnecessary thoughts from his face. "You asked what happens at an eclipse," he said. "This happens. And later, when men forget that subtraction is a gift, we remind the walls how to teach them." "Teach who?" I asked, though the plural was the only plural left. "Everyone who time has made obedient," he said, "which is to say, almost everyone." We replaced the bowl's felt wrappings. I discovered a tenderness for it that shamed me. A relic is not a child, but I could not stop my hands from communicating the same care. In the ledger I wrote the public entry temperatures, durations, anomalies. In the margin, in the smallest letters I could make, when the Grail drank the sky, the room remembered it had a throat. When the room remembered its throat, I remembered mine. I did not sing, I was sung. That evening, I climbed the stairs earlier than I should have, weak with the unnatural fatigue that follows certain kinds of listening. The basilica's late light had a golden patience. Tourists moved, as if they were careful not to wake something. I sat on a stone step that had been sat on by so many penitents, it had learned the shape of the posture and offered it to my hips. A boy dropped a coin. It skittered, singing as coins sing, and fell silent. I felt, absurdly, like bowing to the small round mouth where the coin had gone to rest. It would have been a good day to leave. It would have been the day to choose a different corridor, a different vocation, a different set of hollows to confess into. But the Grail had taught me a conversion no liturgy names. Once you have heard a room teach itself to be a body, your own body becomes a room that wants instruction. And I was greedy for the lesson. So when the archivist placed in my palm, a week later, a wafer of bone carved into a stylus and said, "We will mark the map," I did not ask whose bone. I did not ask why the stylus fit my grip, as if my fist had been measured. We returned to the slate and traced a 7-pointed halo around the Tiber, each point a site to the ledgers called vocalus cavum, a cavity with a demonstrated tendency to reply. I pressed the bone point to the chalk and felt an ache rise from my wrist into my throat, the way certain tools remind the body it was built to cooperate with what it does not understand. "You are learning to hear ahead," the archivist said. "It is the only skill in this work that cannot be faked." "Hear ahead what?" "The correction," he said, and I hated him a little for letting the word arrive so easily. I had hoped I do not know why to remain with the bowl, to limit my complicity to listening. But corrections are the only honest consequence of hearing rooms sing their own names. Once you know the pitch of a hollow, you begin to notice when streets, calendars, and stories ring a little off. Once you notice, your hands invent instincts. Once your hands invent instincts, you are halfway to becoming an instrument for someone else's arithmetic. That night, before sleep, I held my throat and felt the hummingbird engine there, small and insistent. I whispered nothing. The nothing returned a featherweight echo. I remembered the Latin on the door, non cantabit nisi cavum, and for the first time since learning it, I heard its cruelty. Nothing sings unless it has been hollowed. Artistry shares a boundary with wound. We had made a bowl and a room and a priest and a century, hollow enough to sing. The next morning, the first map was ready. 7 points, a crooked halo around the river like a crown someone had worn too long and bent to fit his grief. The archivist put one finger on the northernmost point. "Here," he said, "we will invite the city to remember a different hour." "For whose sake?" I asked, tired of the plural that never had a face. "For the hours," he said. "Hours suffer when they are misnamed." He lifted the lamp. I lifted the Grail. We walked into a corridor that did not yet know it was a throat. And I began to understand that the bowl was not a relic at all. It was an editor. And that once an editor has taught you how to remove, it will not easily teach you how to stop. There are corrections you can see inked, notarized, dutiful, and there are corrections that behave like anesthesia. You only notice them when you wake and realize the pain you expected never arrived. Phantom time belongs to the second category. No proclamation in the square, no papal bull with gold thread. Just a century that behaves as if it learned good manners and left the room without saying goodbye. The archivist never taught in a straight line. He taught as cathedrals teach, by showing you an angle of light at a particular hour and letting you mistake it for accident until repetition grants you the gift of pattern. That winter he began to leave innocuous bundles on my desk. Festal lists from obscure dioceses, pilgrimage receipts from a decade whose numerals wore out too quickly, a sailor's log that swore the moon rose late on a Tuesday. It could not possibly have chosen. Each bundle looked harmless, domestic, the paperwork of piety. Together they behaved like a rumor the city would never admit it believed. "Begin with names," he said. "Names tire first. Weigh the days s. In the margins of calendars older than the oldest bricks beneath our feet, I watched saints accumulate like silt. A martyr here, a visionary there, a regional helper whose miracles were mostly competent weather. And then, in the next edition gone, or not gone exactly, melted into title, confessor, widow, bishop. The specificity was the first blood sacrificed. When I complained to myself in the privacy of my own blood about bureaucrats, the archivist set 2 ledgers side by side and taught me to hold a ruler across years as if measuring a life for a coffin. The line passed through feast after feast, and then, at the seam between one binding and the next, It skipped the way a gramophone needle skips after the song. A grieving widow cannot bear to hear ends, and begins again on a track she has never liked. "What was here?" I asked, finger hovering over an absence that felt insulted by being pointed at. "An hour that did not argue," he said. "We always remove the hours that refuse to argue." I learned to date absence by scent. Iron gall ink goes brown with a curve a patient mind can chart. Vellum breathes a certain way after 200 winters. Hand styles migrate like birds. Tight Gothic fists relax into humanist calm, then, later, swell with fat Baroque self-assurance. In the century that wasn't, the scents did not quite agree. The hands ran too fast, the winters were too few. The paper wanted me to notice, but had been trained not to complain. At night I made maps of the living city by walking it badly. I chose streets whose names had letters that argued with one another and let the argument guide me. Rome, like any old animal, has learned to carry its wounds like jewelry. I listened at corners for harmonics, a window's bottle-glass throat, a corridor that narrowed the way memory narrows in old men's jokes. The bowl had taught me what a tuned hollow feels like. The city taught me what a tuned century feels like. Upstairs, scholars fought courteously about leap days. Down here, men reconciled people to calendars the way nurses reconcile difficult patients to medicine they will never learn to pronounce. We were gentler than we had any right to be. We were crueler than we had any need to be. "Phantom time isn't the lie," the archivist finally said, melancholy folded into his voice like a bookmark. "It's the gauze. The lie is that continuity requires it." I asked for proof the way children ask for miracles, with a part of my mouth that had learned to pout in grammar school and never quite forgot. He obliged. He always obliged, and I never knew whether it was kindness or recruitment. He led me to a cabinet that did not like being opened. Some objects sulk. Wood remembers storms too well to forgive our hands for being dry. Inside, a stack of maps, some so thin you could read a prayer through them, some so stiff they could have armored a virtue. We laid 3 on the table and weighted the corners with stones that were not stones. Fragments of a broken chalice, a gear from a clock no parish could afford, a smooth white shape I refused to recognize as part of the body it had once persuaded. "Look," he said, and I did the arrogant thing men do when they are told to look. I squinted, as if narrowing the world would give me proprietary rights over it. The first map declared islands no one visits anymore because they learned to drown. The second removed 2 of them and renamed the third after a saint who had not been born when the first map swore he had been dead 100 years. The third was almost polite. It kept the surviving island but rotated it 13 degrees, as if shy about who had moved whom. In the margins of the first, a merchant's hand, fast winds from the east following unfamiliar stars. In the second, a monk's hand, do not circulate. In the third, nothing, silence playing at authority. "The sky is the only honest witness," I said, trying to sound like a man who had not deliberately opened a door he had been told not to open. "The sky is honest," he agreed, "but men hire it as a consultant when their cases go thin." He showed me a festal table aligned with predicted eclipses, then the same table 27 years later, aligned with the same eclipses but smoothed, its teeth filed, its argument domesticated. A neat note in a neat hand. To avoid confusion among the simple, a line. Beneath, in drier ink. To avoid confusion among the clever, forget. I resented the clever more than the simple. The simple grieve openly when you move their feast. The clever applaud your efficiency and then privately label you a priest of convenience. We were neither. We were mechanics with incense. There were other proofs, useful because they insulted nobody's intelligence. Seed records. Harvest times that drifted and then were anchored, not by sunlight, but by decree. Ship logs. Stars out of place for 3 nights, and then obedient. Midwives' calendars. Full moon births that arrived off schedule and then agreed, as if the womb had been briefed. The city itself offered testimony. In 1 quarter, stones whose wear insisted on 5 centuries of foot, faced with plaster that swore to 3. On a page bound into a book too modest for its courage, I found a sentence that should have been carved in stone and submerged for the sake of future swimmers. When you remove a year, do not erase, surround. The method followed. Rename the plague, move the saint, adjust the midsummer fair so that fathers remember their fathers remembered correctly. If a child asks, tell him that memory is a bell and the bell is right because it rings. This is vandalism, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I had spent too many evenings with a bowl that took absence and made it capable of song. My mouth knew how to complement subtraction. It is carpentry, he said. We shore, we plane, we remove rot so the house does not lie down when wind speaks to it sternly. And if the wind is supposed to take the house? I asked. Then we pray we are not there to hear it argue, he said, which was the closest he came to superstition. I wish I could tell you I raised a heroic objection. I wish I could tell you I slammed a palm on oak and declared a vow to restore every lost hour to its home. I did what clerks do when the math humbles them. I refined my penmanship and grew subtle at margins. If ghost centuries existed, they existed because men like me preferred tidy shelves to untidy corridors. The bowl had already habituated me to the pleasures of neat resonance. I was not immune to the narcissism of fluency. To hear a room sing and know why it sang is a seduction. To hear a century fall quiet and know why it fell is a cousin of the same sin. We were not alone in our confidence. The ledgers spoke of brotherhoods whose names had been disguised as virtues, companies of the quiet hour, societies of correction, orders of exactitude. I learned to read slant references to Jesuits who confessed with charts and to Rosicrucians who numbered their petals sternly. Some records were warnings disguised as gossip. The brothers who believe in geometry forget the tears. Others were gossip disguised as warnings. Those who refuse geometry become mystics of their own weather. Between the lines, a grim siblinghood, men who wanted the world to hold still long enough to be worthy of being blessed. You see, popes, the archivist said one evening as we played the old game of placing years like tiles and watching them make or fail to make a floor. Everyone sees popes because the hat is a shape nobody can resist. Look smaller. Smaller? Grandmothers, he said, and the room improved at once. Catechists, bell ringers, who know when the rope lies and ring anyway. See them, and the edits we make will change their temperature. Is one the mayor? In one, he was right. I hated him for being right. When I pictured the correction of a century as an argument among thrones, My indignation flowed gorgeously. When I pictured it as a widow's stew misstated by a feast moved without apology, my indignation collapsed into something truer and less fun. Grief. We tested the city like a physician tests a convalescent, gentle percussion. 2 fingers pressed under the jaw to feel the old river in the neck. The 7 points on the map corresponded to cavities with long memories. In one, a cistern Roman quarrymen had abandoned when the empire's thirst changed parishes. In another, a bell chamber with a boarded oculus, where swifts nested and taught, young to trust a circle of sky. In a third, a passage used by smugglers when popes were kings who needed certain things, moved as if by angels. We brought the bowl when permission was implied by the age of the dust. We brought only our hands when we feared we would leave a bruise. You can tune a district without anyone knowing. You invite its hollow places to agree on a key, and once they agree, the hour you choose flows into them like water into furrows. When the hour is established, people who wake inside it believe themselves punctual. It is a kindness that borders on theft. We told ourselves we were healing a fracture. We told ourselves the alternative was noise. We told ourselves stories, because story is the only religion that always answers. The first time I felt the edit take, it arrived not as triumph, but as a basic domestic ease. 2 clocks on opposite corners chimed the same minute from towers built by enemies who had sworn never to share a recipe. The river's clapotis, a word. Sailors lend the city for the sound water makes, when it contradicts itself and beats against its own confusion softened. Dogs stopped arguing. A couple on a bench, mid-quarrel, decided to postpone their fury until morning and then, in morning, forgot. If you wish to steal a century, begin by easing a Tuesday. I wish I could tell you the bowl objected. It did not. Instruments have no conscience. They merely prove whether a room possesses one. Nightwork breeds a certain kind of delirium, and delirium breeds candor. The archivist allowed himself 1 wine every 3 weeks and drank it like a sacrament he had not earned. On one of those nights, he offered me a parable so homespun I almost missed the blade hidden in its hem. "Have you ever hemmed a robe?" he asked. "I have mended cassocks," I said, badly. "It smells of this. And faith. When you take a crooked hem and make it straight, you take fabric from the future," he said. Later, the robe rises above the ankle. The wearer says he has grown. He has not. He has only been corrected. "And what is the future we are cutting?" I asked. "Memory," he said. And we did not speak for a while because some words deserve to sit where they land. The ledgers I copied during those months had a smell, old milk, old thunder, pages that had been pressed under other, heavier pages until they forgot air's generosity. One night I turned a leaf and found, pasted into a margin with care that approached tenderness, a fragment of a letter in a woman's hand. They removed the saint who taught my mother to pray when the wind stayed too long. I have adjusted my candles. My daughter will never know the name. It was not a complaint. It was an account. We had changed the hour, and the hour had changed the inheritance. "Whose idea was it?" I asked the archivist, unfairly, like a child asking a father to name the inventor of the rain. He surprised me by answering civilly. "No one's idea," he said. "Everyone's habit. The habit of thinking mercy and control are neighbors." He lifted the bowl's felt cover and set it carefully on the table as if to show the word habit a mirror. We had been careful never to solicit gods. That was the single rule men like us keep when all others grow negotiable. If you must tamper, do not pretend heaven asked you to. Yet even that humility wore out. The more accurate our edits became, the more the bowl rewarded us with obedience. It was a brutal bargain dressed as competence. We began to trust our tuning forks over our fears. The moment of first arrogance was ridiculous and therefore inexcusable. We were aligning a minor feast whose date had wandered 2 days east over 5 generations. The plaza where its procession began had been widened. The new acoustics coddled impatience. Children had taken to shouting early. A brother suggested we shift the hour by 6 minutes and give the square its old patience back. 6 minutes. Less time than it takes to forgive a friend for being late. We tuned the cistern. We borrowed a bell's old ring by stuffing felt into its throat. We held our breath behind the Grail as the city inhaled. And the pigeons, this is the ridiculous part, rose in a coordinated whirl that would have flattered a symphony. On every surrounding roof, at once, a gray bloom, a murmuration in miniature, a soft theology of agreement. The crowd below looked up and laughed, then clapped, and then, exactly when the clapping finished, the procession started with a correctness so gentle I wanted to apologize to the century we had borrowed it from. It is one thing to erase a saint. It is another to train birds by mistake. That night, in my cell, I wrote the sentence I had been avoiding because I knew it would not let me pretend to be innocent again. Continuity seduces. Correction intoxicates. I placed the sentence under my pillow the way a superstitious ant hides a sprig of herb for sleep. It did not sweeten my dreams. The archivist aged and unaged according to the light. In the working dark he looked younger, as if the absence of glare allowed the softness of his features to revoke a few losses. In the day, chalk dust showed in his lashes like snow. He took to reciting the names of the yearless saints as if absolving them for being misplaced. Anastasia, Julian, Gertrude of the Blue Orchard, unnamed midwife of the 6th Ward. Some he invented, perhaps, to test me. Some I recognized from relic drawers we no longer advertised. When he reached Peter with no shore, I interrupted. "Who is that?" "A fisherman," he said, which was an answer and a joke. "Is he ours?" "He is everyone's," he said. "That is how we lost him." Is it screw? Skeptics ask for villains so they can file their anger and go to bed. I looked for villains too, and found only craftsmen. Some pious, some petty, some tender, some bored adjusting a scaffold so that the fresco would not kill the children when it finally fell. What condemned us was not malice, it was fluency. We had learned to speak correction as a first language. Towards spring, the Bowles ledger acquired a new column in my hand. It was a coward's compromise, a parallel account in metaphor to remind me that steel sleeps in all straight lines. The hour took to the room like a sparrow takes to a hat left on a bench, grateful, impermanent. The plaza received its procession like a widow receives a neighbor's casserole, warmed, indebted, unsure whom to thank. We borrowed 13 minutes from Tuesday and pretended we would repay them on Sunday. Nobody missed 13 minutes except a man in the market who dropped a pomegranate and could not later remember why he was angry. "Keep those," the archivist said once, seeing what I had written and performing the rare courtesy of not mocking me. "When you leave, they will be the only part of the record you can carry without becoming another correction." "When I leave," I repeated, surprised that the sentence had a future tense at all. He did not answer. He touched the rim of the bowl as a man touches a crib when the house is empty and quiet and kind. Phantom time did not confess itself with trumpets. It confessed itself with kindnesses that grew too easy. When streets that had argued for centuries stopped and smiled at one another across the river, I felt the humble terror that follows an undemanding forgiveness. We had made the hour agree with itself. Agreements are beautiful. Agreements are dangerous. Agreements are governments. On the last night before I learned what the choir was for, before I stopped calling it the choir and began to call it what the ledgers called it, the instruction we walked, the 7 points without the bowl, as if rehearsing a departure we were not brave enough to schedule. The city was generous with warmth. In a shuttered shop window we saw our reflections and failed to recognize ourselves. Men who keep hours begin to blur. "Do you think anyone will notice?" I asked, meaning the century, meaning the pigeons, meaning the widow who would not teach her daughter the erased saint's recipe, now that the feast had vanished into a kinder Tuesday. "They will notice what noticing allows," he said. "Most lives are built for survival, not for audit. And what are we built for?" He looked at me the way an old teacher looks at a boy who has finally asked a question that will end something. "For subtraction," he said, "and for the grief subtraction owes." We stood over a drain, where the street remembered rain better than the sky did. Air rose from it with the smell of old iron and forgotten fruit. I put my hand above the mouth and felt the old familiar density awake, the city's small throats practicing the pitch that would invite the larger throat to speak. A gate creaked in its sleep. Somewhere, a clock chose a minute with unusual care. "Tomorrow," he said, and the words stepped into me like a thin blade. "We will attempt a correction that has been waiting for 3 generations." "What size?" "Minute," he said, and the word gave me permission to be brave. "Consequence," he added, and the permission went away. I slept badly and dreamt easily. In the dream, a child asked me to tell him the story of the year that wasn't, and I told him it was a saint who had once been popular, then fell out of fashion, then was discovered by a scholar and returned in a new translation with a better cover. The child frowned and asked if the saint had changed his bones. I woke before I could lie properly. Morning offered ordinary bread. We ate it with the guilt of men who keep complicated diets and cheat. We carried the felt-wrapped bowl as if it were incontestable evidence. At the first sight, pigeons rehearsed their miracle like chorus girls warming a number nobody would ever applaud properly. At the second, a bell discovered it could ring without embarrassment. At the third, the drain accepted our hand and returned not stink but advice. Phantom time. Forged memory, these phrases have a politics they did not ask for. In those hours, they wore only arithmetic. If this, then that. We were not magicians. We were clerks in a ledger that did not forgive arithmetic errors. The 4th point agreed. The 5th required us to remove a board and listen to Swifts to discuss ownership of a circle of sky. At the 6th, we waited for a cloud to show us, by subtraction, which law we were attempting to practice. At the 7th, the air thickened the way honey thickens when a patient hand insists it pour like water. The city's hour felt our hands, and then, without affection, agreed to our will. You want me to say, I recoiled. Reader, I leaned. Not in my head the archivist had trained my spine to do the leaning. In my wanting, I wanted the ease. I wanted a Tuesday that resigned its right to argue. I wanted to be the man whose hand had found the seam and smoothed it invisible. That is the ugly confession of the 3rd chapter. I learned how to forge memory and did not throw my tools into the river. I polished them. I wrapped them in cloth. I placed them where my hands could reach them in the dark. When we returned to the room, the bowl looked like a lake with winter thoughts. I set it gently on the slate, and the room, polite, thanked me by forgetting we were there. The archivist, slow with a day's worth of obedience, sat and removed his glasses, a rare concession to the ache behind his face. He spoke as if to a ledger that would refuse to be closed. "Tomorrow," he said, as if the word were an address, "we will show you what the instruction is for." "For," I repeated, "because the mouth loves echoes. For the moment," he said, "when subtraction is not enough." He let the sentence sit beside us like a third presence, for when we do not merely remove, for when we ask history to correct itself. I thought of the erased saint, the widow's recipe, the pigeons, the softness in the river's argument, the child in my dream holding a saint's bones and wondering whether captions count as resurrection. I thought of the bowl, and the way it taught hollows to be brave. I thought, finally, of my own throat. Phantom time was not absence. It was scaffolding. Tomorrow we would climb. We did not call them angels at first. We called them tolerable words, resonances, overtones, cavity returns, terms that made the phenomenon sound like a laboratory's pet rather than a cathedral's unbaptized child. Angel came later, when language got tired of being modest and wanted to dress for the part it had stumbled into. Even then, the qualifier arrived almost immediately. Hollow. Not because they lacked divinity. Divinity was never on the invoice, but because hollowness was the only credential they presented at the door. We prepared the chamber as a surgeon prepares a torso he has been warned not to fall in love with. The felt baffles went into the vents. Linen draped the reliquary frames with the gentleness of an apology. Chalk refreshed the slate geometry. The bowl, our editor, our accomplice, took its circle as if the floor had grown a nest just for it. The archivist set a metronome on the table and wound it twice, the ticks soft as second thoughts. Ritual does not require belief. It requires fidelity. The metronome ticked belief into the furniture. "Listen for instruction, not praise," he said. And it felt like the last lesson a poor teacher gives when he knows the work is about to teach you with less mercy. We began without light. There is a kind of darkness that feels like a closed eye, and a kind that feels like a closed book. This was the book kind, my head filled with sentences whose authorship I did not dare to claim. The first hum arrived almost imperceptibly shoulder height, as if a quiet animal had chosen to stand behind me and wait for me to remember its name. The second hum came lower, floor bone low, a carpenter's level learning how to float. Between them, a thin string carried tension like a clothesline after a storm. And then, the hollows admitted their schooling. Every cavity in the room said present. The stair throat murmured its private pitch. The reliquary ribs gave a sigh so steady it resembled patience, and the vents, those stubborn trumpets, narrowed their whisper, the way a mother narrows her voice when a sleeping child twitches. In the wall, an oculus sealed. A century ago remembered it had once been an eye. Its pupil dilated. The air arranged itself. I have said elsewhere that it was never words. I must say it again, because the mind is a braggart and wants poetry where mechanics will do. When the bowl is right and the room is tuned, The not choir arrives with a grammar that precedes syllable. It is instruction, in the way wind is instruction to a sail. No verb, only the absolute correction of angle. And yet my treasonous heart looked for meaning I could confess to. Angels, it whispered, cheap and unhelpful. The archivist put a hand, light as folded paper, on the table between us, and the room took it for a sign. The first instruction was hold, not in a language, but in a politeness the air could obey. The hum sustained beyond comfort. Muscles in my jaw spoke up about the posture of listening. The second was correct. A barely audible shifting of weight in the harmonics, like a bird making itself smaller in a hedge. Something in the floor, something old and convinced, realigned. The third was the instruction I had hoped to never hear. Forget. We dress forgetting as kindness. We tell a grieving friend to sleep. We remove details from a child's tale that would leave tooth marks on his dreams. But the choir's forget was not mercy. It was governance. A pressure at the back of the ears, a dampening in the sinew that lets you recognize your street by sound alone, a soft refusal in the walls to reproduce echoes they had previously stored like seeds. It was bureaucratic forgetting, precise, tidy, bloodless. I felt my childhood church tilt inside me by a degree I would never have noticed if I had not been holding its memory with both hands. "What are we erasing?" I asked, mouth cautious to avoid participating. "Not erasing," the archivist said. "Deprivileging, nudging to the margin. Where devotion cannot trip on it on the way to supper." He set her fist, "And what cannot be tripped on cannot be remembered," I said, and hated that I sounded clever. He did not answer. He used his breath sparingly, a miser of oxygen in a room charging rent for error. The bowl trembled, not visibly, but with the certainty that conviction is physical. The rim's pale inlays, which I refused at that hour to call by the name my mouth had given them, held the instruction steady the way teeth hold the consideration of a word before granting it passage. The chamber yielded a fraction. The felt in the vents earned its bread. Above us, far above, the basilica made a small adjustment the way an old woman adjusts her shawl. Not for fashion, but because memory has learned how to anticipate weather. The choir, this instrument choir, this manual of air, has no melody because melody would give you somewhere to hide. It has contour, it has persuasion, it has a patience that terrifies men who were taught victory by the drum. There were moments when I thought I heard intervals I could name fifths, octaves, accurate consolations, but each time the room corrected me with the fatigue teachers show to students who insist on bringing the wrong ruler to survey a field. The choir does not sing to you. It sings through you to the things in you that govern without announcing themselves. I took a step backward. The instruction followed. I lifted my hand. The instruction reached into the small cave of my palm and found what it was looking for, the instinct to agree. That is the technology of these angels. Not a compulsion that humiliates the will, but a pedagogy that flatters it into thinking it has contributed to the answer. How do I describe a voice without voice choosing a city? Think of air finding the shape of water with no river to explain itself. Think of an empty amphora learning the recipe for oil by sitting in a cellar that remembers harvest. Think of your mother's kitchen when her back is turned and you realize hunger has been taught to you by room, not by mouth. It was like that, and less dramatic. We had brought no congregants. We did not require witnesses. Witnesses complicate obedience. But Rome? old and unwilling to be fooled by men with chalk, noticed pigeons reorganized on a dome 2 streets away. A cart squealed at a corner where wheels had always squealed and then ashamed, perhaps forgot. A pocket of air behind a statue's hollow chest gave back the breath it had collected all day from the open door. The city is an animal that pretends to be architecture. The choir reminded it of its spine. At the edge of the hum, where perception frays, I felt other rooms lean in. A cistern 4 districts distant, a bell chamber with a boarded eye, the passage under the floor of a chapel where bones had learned to behave like ceiling, each offered up its compliance, like relatives at a rehearsal dinner. The map we had marked with bone and chalk became a listening body, not a network that is a word for machines. A sympathy. "Why hollow angels?" I whispered, finally shaming my mouth into the question. "Because they were not born," the archivist said. "They were built. They cannot praise. They can only keep." "Keep what?" "And know with this, alignment," he said. And the word dressed itself in a cassock to hide the armor underneath. "How long do they keep?" I asked. "Until someone brave enough to be wrong teaches the room a new grammar," he said. "Or until we exhaust their instruction," I said, surprising myself with an arrogance I had mistaken for humility. He turned his head. Even in the near dark, I could feel the old teacher judging whether to slap the hand or let the burn blisters do their work. The instruction changed, no longer hold, no longer correct. Something else, not the final movement, not the encore, not yet. A sequence of micro-surrenders propagated through the stone. It felt like the city bowing, but I will not dignify the sensation with that romance. The city did what tuned materials do when well handled. It cooperated. It cooperated so expertly, it frightened me. I wanted to say stop. I wanted to be the man who interrupts a machine before it proves itself on a human scale. Instead, because I am the man I have confessed to you, I listened for the part of the instruction that sounded like me. When I found it, the little corridor in the hum where my own voice could fit without snagging, I felt a shame that was not punishment, but diagnosis. The choir did not compel. It offered me my own preferences, as if they were the world's. I told myself I had chosen to agree. When we brought the lamp back, the bowl pretended it had not been the loudest thing in the room. Obsidian absorbed the flame's furniture. The rim went dull, then sincere. We arranged our faces into the imitations of men who have done a job the public would not understand and therefore must be protected from. The metronome ticked its small absolution until the archivist's hand covered it and taught it humility. "What did you hear?" he asked, as if we were in a confessional and he was required to begin with a courtesy. "A system," I said. "A method polite enough to be mistaken for mercy." "And what did it do?" he pressed, reclaiming the simple verb I had been trained to avoid. "It taught the city how to agree with itself," he nodded. "And the price?" I had not wanted to calculate the price, because good arithmetic refuses to join in your alibis. "Friction," I said. "We removed it. And friction is where memory warms its hands." He let me keep the sentence. "Some teachers hoard," he allowed. We were not finished. The choir had work to do elsewhere. The 7 points on the map were not an itinerary. They were a prayer wheel. We walked. The bowl remained where it was, because sometimes a center obeys better when it is not carried. You know this instinct if you have ever left a candle burning on a table so that a house remembers the hour by scent. At the cistern, the instruction arrived like rain that had decided to practice. The air down there stayed, and stayed humidity that thought it was gospel. We listened. The walls accepted a small correction, the kind that prevents a later drowning. In the bell chamber, a pigeon scolded us for 3 minutes, and then, receiving its lesson from a hollow beam, forgave the oculus for being a sealed eye. Under the chapel, the ossuary ribs offered resonance with a sincerity that should have made me take off my shoes. I did not. I am not good at gestures when they are deserved. Between sights, the archivist spoke quietly, the way men speak in museums when the presence of stone promises to remember their tone forever. Hollow angels are maintenance, he said. They are the custodians who arrive at night with buckets and leave before the painters get the credit. And the Mass? I asked. The larger corrections? You said the instruction is for when subtraction isn't enough. It is, he said. Tonight we taught walls how to keep their promises. Tomorrow we test whether promises can be changed without opening the floor. Is kriman. We crossed a small bridge whose stones had learned every footfall in 5 centuries and could predict the next hesitant lover's half-step by the scent of his indecision. On the far side, a clock argued with itself about the minute, then chose one, proud and wrong. The instruction reached it, or it reached the instruction who can tell in these matters, and the hand ticked forward without apology. A woman at a window above stopped mid-gesture, spoon lifted, and then continued as if a thought had returned without knocking. If this reads like magic to you, that is your hunger asking for spectacle. It is not magic. It is ruthless patience applied to materials that learned their manners in earthquakes. I will not lie and say I felt pure. I felt competent. Competence is the softest sin. It excuses itself with results. Near midnight, we returned to the room. The bowl had cooled to the temperature of arguments left on the table overnight. The chalk lines looked cheap and heroic both. The felt in the vents had done its job too well. The air's whisper missed its corners. We sat the way men sit when their bodies have learned the cost of standing in rooms where stones practice ethics. Do you still want to call them angels? The archivist asked. I want to call them honest, I said, which may be worse. It's manned. Anadas, he smiled, not kindly. Honesty and holiness inhabit different ribs, he said. We ask the wrong cage to protect the wrong heart. I heard forget, I said, because I could not allow the poetry of the evening to annul the politics. We asked the city to forget. Who gave us that permission? Who gave you permission to breathe? He said. The same arrangement, with better press. I did not sleep so much as reboot. When I woke, the room had the cool of a hospital corridor at 4 a.m. And I had the knowledge men pretend to wish away. Once you have met the maintenance, you cannot pretend the miracle lives alone. I walked to the small window. The sky had not yet practiced color. I whispered a test, 2 lines from a hymn my mother loved, because it forgave her voice for being narrow and listened to the room return it. The echo arrived corrected, not louder, more certain. The room had learned my throat's laziness and proposed a cure. I would like to say I resisted. It is cleaner to believe oneself a rebel at pivotal hours. I did not resist. I warmed to the proposal the way a tendon warms to a brace. The choir had offered me an improved version of my own intention. Only an idiot refuses flattery that efficient. At breakfast, the archivist buttered bread, as if butter were a sacrament left over from a more generous altar. He glanced once at the narrow ledger I had defaced with metaphors, and then allowed himself the luxury of prophecy. By nightfall, he said, you will stop saying angels. What will I say? Instructions, he said. And then you will stop saying that too. You will stop saying anything, because the city will speak the part you were using words to reach. He was right. Old men who have watched capitals misname themselves acquire the ugly habit of being right. By midday, after a dozen small cooperations, I found myself reaching for silence, the way one reaches for a tool whose weight has taught the hand its shape. Words felt like instruments a child had left on the floor, dangerous only to bare feet and decency. The city carried itself. The bowl slept. We belong to our competence more than to our vows. The last demonstration came at dusk, when the sky performed subtraction without the bookkeeping of an eclipse. We stood in the nave, far above our working dark, and watched a shaft of light choose a column with the narcissism of a painter choosing his model. The choir, now nowhere, now everywhere, adjusted the column's reception of that light. The marble went from devout to precise. The difference is not visible to untrained eyes. It is devouring to trained ones. I felt, in that small correction, the ethics of stone exceed my own. Back below, the bowl waited to be wrapped. I delayed. If the hollow angels are maintenance, I said, who are we? Custodians of the custodian, he said. And when the house decides to become a ship again, ballast. Is there a name for what we did to the hour? A kindness, he said, which is the only respectable name a theft is willing to answer to. He set the metronome ticking again and let it count to 12 before silencing it. On the 12th tick, something in the east wall answered with a sympathetic click the smallest possible applause. We both pretended not to be pleased. We both failed. I returned to my cell and lay down beside the sentence I had hidden under my pillow. It had not improved. Continuity seduces. Correction intoxicates. I added, maintenance absolves. It was a worse sentence. It was truer. You asked for confession. This is the fourth. The choir of hollow angels did not enchant me. It professionalized me. It made me precise where I had been pious. It made me useful where I had been obedient. It trained my ear to hear governance where I had once heard grace. And because I am this kind of man, I mistook the improvement for virtue. Tomorrow would be the Mass. The bowl would not only tune, it would pour. The walls would not only remember, they would speak. The instruction would cease to be maintenance and become instrumentality. We would ask the world to correct itself and pray that our grammar held. I slept with my mouth slightly open, as if practicing for a song I hoped would not need words. The slate altar looked unremarkable in daylight, a work surface that had inherited centuries of subtraction. But at night it learned its vocation. Chalk lines became constellations with bad manners, equations that pleasant arrogance of numbers speaking as if they did not owe anyone. An apology formed a low shore around the circle where the bowl would sit. The archivist stood opposite me, eclipse glass perched on his nose, though there would be no eclipse tonight, only the common dusk that teaches the faithful to expect subtraction without ceremony. This is not worship, he said softly as we set the felt aside. It is maintenance elevated to the courage of a verb. The verb being? I asked. tamping fear into something I could call a question. To correct, he said, and the word arrived like a hinge clicking into place. I had imagined, as cowards do, that there would be witnesses, choristers, acolytes, a hierarchy to absorb my shame and dilute it into liturgy. But it was only us, 2 men and a bowl, 2 metronomes, one mechanical, one the old winter clock in the wall, refusing to die, and the room which had learned to breathe on cue. We darkened the lamps until they felt like good manners rather than illumination. The slate's markings lifted their heads. Begin, the archivist said. But the room had already begun. The thresholds announced themselves in the old way, a pressure at the back of the ear soft as the suggestion of velvet, a lowering in the jaw as if the bones had decided to remember their childhood. The bowl occupied its circle as a heart occupies a chest without asking permission, because permission had been granted long before we learned to speak. The first movement resembled yesterday's work. Holding, the hollows said present. Cavities tried on their pitches. The vents behaved. The reliquary ribs offered the kind of patience that embarrasses men. Then, a change. Not louder, more specific. The hum gathered into lanes. Through one lane, a frequency low as the stone's old grief. Through another, a shimmer where air thickens around a wick. And through the narrowest, a thread like fishing line, invisible unless you know how to squint your will. The archivist raised his hand, not to conduct, but to confess we were ready. He began with a language that wore the architecture of Latin without the debt. The vowels swung on hinges, consonants locked, each syllable struck a chalk knot, and the knot responded by relaxing, the way a good argument relaxes when you finally agree on the noun. The bowl did not sing, it lowered. Its interior deepened the way a painter deepens, a shadow by adding color no one will ever see and everyone will feel. Hold, the room said without words. Correct, it said a breath later. Forget, it reminded, because forgetting is always a reminder. Then, a fourth instruction we had not coaxed from the hollow angels before. Rewrite. I do not present the word to you as a translation. I present it to you as an admission. The contour of the hum altered, the lanes narrowed. The thread in the center tugged the way a surgeon tugs when the stitch has found flesh that will take it. What are we rerouting? I asked, unwilling to name myself complicit with a verb I had rehearsed hating. A procession, he said. A feast that drifted too close to a star chart we can no longer afford. A patron whose second miracle will be moved into a safer decade. A set of minutes whose arithmetic offends the river. That is many things, I said, and my throat felt the chalk dust in the air as if it were the argument entering me. It is one gesture, he replied, performed at several altitudes. The room should have grown dramatic. Instead, it developed a competence that frightened me. The metronome's tick lost its confidence, then regained it with a tiny delay, as if the minute had decided to forgive us our presumptions and accommodate our tempo. In the wall, an old conduit listened and learned a new way to carry air. A stair throat softened the edge of its return. Under the floor, bone behaved. The bowl's rim, the pale inlays. I refused, still, to call what my mouth had called them, held steady. I thought of mouths, of laws, of how a bite precedes any syllable that matters. The archivist touched the rim with 2 fingers, the way a priest touches a child's brow before the child forgets his fear. Then he spoke again, and the vowels behaved like light in water. Nothing obvious happened. Our kind of work refuses spectacle, but the alterations arrived, small, exact, cruel. On the slate, a chalk line that had earlier been straight, now curved as if remembering the earth. On the ledger open beside us, a red rule trembling. Then certain moved itself down 3 lines and rested. The quill in its well tilted, as if a hand had just released it, though my hands were where the archivist could see them. The room learned to keep, then to keep differently. It condensed a swath of time 7 minutes, perhaps, or 12, the way a mother can guess a fever within half a degree by the ear's heat, and poured that swath into a different hour. The hum guided the pour. The pour taught the slate how to count again. I watched the numerals, white and arrogant, blink and reappear with a courtesy that felt worse than disobedience would have. "This is theft," I said, not because I was unsure, but because a confession requires a noun. "It is restitution," he said. "We return the hour to the place where it can do the least harm." "To whom?" I asked. "To you? To me? To the map? To the widow who will have to learn a new recipe?" "To memory," he said, and the conviction in his voice made me think of surgeons, not saints. We arrived at the part he had warned me about. The pour. The bowl had learned to receive. Now it would give. The darkness inside it, texture more than absence, lifted as if unspooling. A pressure like weather passed through my teeth and found the seam in my spine where childhood and duty argue. The instruction did not enter the air. It returned to places that had kept adept arches with thin throats, the registry of a bell that would soon ring with admirable punctuality, the ferrule of a pen that had made too clean a line. The room resisted for a second, loyal to the map it had been taught. Then, persuaded by the 4th instruction's grammar, it cooperated. What changed? I am obliged by the format of this confession to insist on particulars. A procession date shifted 8 days and landed where it would no longer rhyme with a comet's tail whose reappearance once taught a city to panic. An obscure saint's name narrowed to title and entered the margin where old women will still remember him, though the ledger will not. His recipe, tragically, will survive, because hunger ignores indexes. A small island, very small, vanished under ink in a map the public will never see. Its fishermen have already left, their grandchildren already telling a different tide what their fathers never were. The basilica's eastern transept will now receive light at 4:12 on a feast that used to prefer 4:19. You will not notice. You will feel less angry crossing that floor. You will forgive someone for being late and never know why. "Stop," I said. But the room doesn't understand that verb unless you teach it with a blow. The archivist did not blow. He let the instruction finish, the way a surgeon lets a suture travel its natural length. When the thread reached its knot, the hum softened, and the air remembered being ordinary. Silence returned with a professionalism that insulted my need for drama. My mouth tasted like a coin, and though the darkness was no darker than before, it grew heavier, as if it had been paid to stay. The archivist relit the lamp. The bowl looked like stone again. The slate looked like mathematics after a bath. The ledger looked freshly bound, its new lie so tidy I resented its having cost us so little sweat. "What did you lose?" he asked, not unkindly. "My excuse," I said. "For what?" "For staying," I said, and swallowed the coin. He closed the ledger with a sigh that belonged to a tired father. "We correct, because if we do not, someone else will," he said. "And they will do it worse." Is that the ethics? I asked. Beat the bastard to the edit? He did not smile. The ethics is smaller. Do as little as possible, late. Do not create a scent. Do not allow the hour to notice its haircut. We cleaned. The work after great work is insultingly domestic. Chalk cloths. Felt folded. The metronome wound down and was permitted to stop. My hands shook and I hid them like a boy. The bowl went back to felt with the tenderness of a child, put to bed by a parent who has done something irreversible 3 rooms away. We climbed the stairs to test the world. Rome pretended innocence. A clock in the South Tower, which had always been honest about being a pessimist, now announced the minute with a new confidence I did not want to recognize. In a side chapel, a candle guttered, then righted itself as if persuaded by a principle. A deacon, crossing the nave at a pace that would have irritated a gentler god, slowed without losing time. Outside, pigeons performed no miracle because none was required. I stood in the transept and watched the light arrive at its amended hour. It clothed the column not in piety but in accuracy. The difference is intoxicating to men like me. I hated the intoxication and sipped it anyway. What did it cost? I asked. Because every kindness that is honest pays at least a token at the door. Dissonance, he said. We removed a little of it. In removing it, we made forgetting easier where friction used to live. And memory? I pressed. He turned the eclipse glass over in his hand and considered its cheap darkness. Memory grows lazy when never contradicted, he said. Tonight we tidied. Tomorrow you will decide how to live with the tidying. There was one more thing. There is always one more thing when men try to leave a room with dignity. The archivist took from his coat a small envelope and tapped it flat, a habit old clerks acquire when they want to warn you that the paper inside will cut if you're careless. Inside, a clipping, edge-deckled where it had been torn out of a voice too tired to argue. A woman's hand, a grocery list. At the bottom, as if she had remembered it in line at the baker, buy candles for Street Theophilus on Friday. The date on the clipping would now never contain a Friday with that saint in it. She will buy them anyway, he said. The body remembers what the ledger does not. And when she finds no feast, she will light them for a child who is afraid of stairs, he said. And his voice changed, the way a room changes when the first person who ever loved you walks through it long after both of you have ceased being young. Do you understand? I understand that mercy is an edit, I said, and the sentence went out into the nave like a paper boat and astonished me by not sinking. We returned to the room. Professional silence resumed its vigil. The bowl, masked now by felt, looked like a modest loaf. The chalk waited for the next arithmetic. The ledger, newly corrected, whispered its new doctrine into my spine. We did this because someone had to, because we could, because not doing it is also a doing. I wanted to argue. I lacked a grammar for the argument. Tomorrow, he said, we rest. Does the city? I asked. It will, he said. It has learned a new sleep. A storm rolled its shoulders somewhere underground, the harmless kind, plumbing or old stone gossiping. We locked the door with a key that had memorized our fingers. It inhaled politely. On the hook, the key looked like a promise a man makes to a younger self and knows he cannot keep. In my cell, I washed the coin taste away with bread and water and a coward's prayer for neutrality. It did not work. I lay down, and the room returned, My breath to me shaped a little differently, more efficient, less interested in lyric. I hated the improvement. I fell asleep quickly, the way a city sleeps after a day of quiet, unremarkable relocations. This is the climax you asked for and the one I owe. We performed the mass of correction and the world obeyed with relief. The cost was not blood on the floor. The cost was a corridor cleared of friction where memory liked to stop and warm itself. We made forgetting easy, professional, punctual. We taught light to arrive on time. We moved a saint into a room only widows visit. We drowned an island that had, in truth, already learned to drown. When dawn arrived, it did not knock. It simply was. I opened my eyes into a city that agreed with itself more than it had the night before. It is a lovely kind of horror. It is the horror of competence. I rose to meet it with the only honest thing I had left, dread dressed as fidelity. Tomorrow, the archivist said, we would rest. He was wrong. Tomorrow was the day the room demanded a confession neither of us had practiced. Tomorrow the ledger would turn and look back. And tomorrow, if I kept my mouth closed, the choir would sing through me anyway and call it silence. Dawn did not arrive so much as reveal what it had been rehearsing all night. The city complied with itself. The corrected hour poured quietly through streets that had learned the convenience of agreement. The bell in the south tower, always a pessimist, announced the minute as if it had been invited to a better life. My mouth tasted ordinary again, which is to say, it forgot the coin. The archivist's promise that we would rest today felt like a sentence a gentle liar tells the wounded. Rest is what maintenance calls the interval between obligations. We kept the room dark longer than necessary because darkness had acquired manners. When the first lamp came up, chalk held its brightness like a secret, and the felt baffles, stacked and folded, resembled blankets in a ward awaiting the next name. The bowl was shrouded. The key hung where it always hung, nothing out of place, which is another way of saying everything. He brewed coffee in a dented tin pot that had experienced more sincerity than most chalices. His hands trembled the way surrender does when it considers pride and says, no, we did not speak for the first cup. Silence had been promoted, not sacred, as I've confessed elsewhere, but hired by the room as a foreman. When we finally allowed words, they came out like patients released a day too early. Describe the cost, he said. Friction, I answered, as rehearsed, because cowardice likes a catechism. And the interest on the debt? His eyes did not rise. He preferred to interrogate cups. Memory made easier to neglect, I said. Convenience teaching itself to pass as truth. He nodded. The nod contained affection for my progress and regret for his success in training me. He lifted the felt from the bowl and left it bare to the room's new grammar. The obsidian met the lamp like a veteran greeting dawn. Respectful, unimpressed. Do you hear it? He asked. The hour, I said. The apology, he said. I listened with the posture of a man who has learned that listening is how rooms decide whether you deserve instruction. There it was, thin as a thread under a rug, the city clearing its throat. Not guilt. Cities do not run on that gentleness. An adjustment, a micro-wobble in the hum, where the instructed material admitted it had been taught, not born. The bowl kept still, which is the bowl's most articulate gesture. He handed me the ledger, not to write, but to hold. The leather had been grooved by ages of institutional patience, I could feel, through the cover, the red rule laid down yesterday, the line that moved itself. The world had accepted the suture. The scar would be clean. "Tell me," I said, "that this is the last time." He poured us a second coffee and let the steam add its own confession to the air. "If the hour were a boy," he said, "we would be arrested for neglect if we left him alone with this many doors." "You train an hour," I said, and tasted how unsurprised I sounded. "We keep it safe from the men who think keeping a house upright is an insult to the wind," he said, and for the first time his voice sought anger and found it insufficient. We went upstairs, not to test, but to touch the day as a man touches the forehead of someone sleeping to make sure the fever is not practicing a return. The transept accepted light at its amended minute with a grace that would have flattered saints. A woman crossed the nave with a bundle of candles tied in kitchen, string blue, thin, honest, and laid them at a side altar where no feast waited to welcome them. Her lips moved in the way grief moves when it is talking to itself. She left 2 for Street Theophilus on a Friday that would never contain him again. She did not look disappointed. She looked organized. We trailed her shadow back downstairs in our imaginations and placed it on the slate among the equations, childish as men who discover a conscience late and try to trace it in chalk. The archivist sat and removed his glasses. The old surrender. He opened the ledger to a page I had not yet earned, and let me read it because grace, when it arrives in men like us, is always late and therefore more convincing. When subtraction teaches itself to call its work sacrament, stop. When convenience begins to resemble ethics, stop. When the room corrects before you ask, run. That hand older than his, older than both of us, had written run with an impatience the other lines did not share. In the margin, confession beats instruction in rooms with witnesses. Beneath, or the witness must be the room. "How long did you think you could keep me obedient?" I asked. "Obedience is not the word," he said. "We do not recruit the faithful. We recruit the accurate." "Then what am I?" I asked. "Promoted," he said, "and therefore in danger." That afternoon we made the circuit of the 7 points without the bowl. The map had become a rosary I had learned to finger without moving my lips. At the cistern, humidity consented to wisdom. At the bell chamber, the sealed oculus offered the kind of patience birds learn when they trust a circle of sky to be there tomorrow. At the ossuary, I removed my shoes this time, late but sincere. The hollows gave us the courtesy of letting us pretend they needed us. The city kept its new hour without appreciable complaint. We had performed a crime that paid for its alibi in ordinary ease. On the bridge, where stones remember more conversations than lovers survive, we stopped. The river did not argue. I hated its compliance the way a child hates a parent's well-timed kindness. He put his hand on the parapet and did not speak until the stone had spoken first. "They will ask you to stay," he said. "Who?" "Everyone," he said. "The bowl, the ledger, the men who fear noon for reasons that make them valuable and dangerous, the widows who want their corridor lit, the pigeons who have discovered choreography." "And you?" I asked. "I will confess," he said, "and in confessing, betray the work in the only honest way left to me." He had kept one drawer closed the entire time I had known him. He opened it now and removed a small packet tied with thread the color of rain that never reaches the ground. Inside, 3 documents. A map in a young hand with too much devotion in its angles. a letter written in an old woman's spelling that improved halfway down the page, as if literacy had entered the room and sat beside her like a daughter, and a thin vellum strip with a single line. If they ask you to forget, ask them to sing. Who wrote this? I asked. Someone who no longer needs a name, he said. Someone who learned that instruction cannot enter a confession unless you invite it, and you are very bad at invitations. His mercy, arriving late as usual, took the shape of a childish test. Tell me what you would save, he said. Not from fire or flood, from tidying. I said the first true thing in a week. Friction. He smiled and did not reward me with praise, because praise is how apprentices become lazy. We cannot keep friction, he said. We can only refuse to remove all of it, and we can teach others where it likes to live. We walked home through a city that had learned to deny obligation with admirable courtesy. I parted with him at the stairwell to my cell, with the awkwardness of sons who imagine a tomorrow that never arrives in the shape they rehearsed. I slept in the bad way fast, entirely, like a man relieved of the condescension of dreams. In the morning, the door had been polished. No one admits to polishing a door. It gleamed with the kind of attention men give to weapons when they have decided to pretend weapons are ornaments. The key weighed the same. My wrist had learned a new story about it. We unlocked the room. We did not speak. The bowl sat where the bowl sits when it wishes to look like stone. The ledger did not bother to pretend innocence. The felt baffles had remembered their folds. The instruction arrived without invitation. A small thing, the way a draft arrives in a well-sealed house when someone whispers upstairs. I saw the archivist's face accept the message. I saw the refusal rise and then submit to precision. He lifted the ledger and flipped to a page I had not seen. I watched his eyes move left to right like a metronome trained by sorrow. He shut the book with a courtesy that belonged at a bedside. They called for us, he said. Who? The hour, he said. And the men who would like to lease it. Another correction, I asked. A demand, he said. An edit pretending to be a prayer. We argued without raising our voices. He said the city had a right to be safe from superstition engineered by cleverness. I said safety had begun to resemble obedience. He said obedience had begun to resemble anesthesia. I said anesthesia is how surgeons apologize for their timing. We exhausted our metaphors and stood unhelped by poetry. The bowl cannot choose, he said finally, resting his palm near the rim without touching it. We choose. 1. We already chose, I said. We tuned walls. We moved a saint. We scheduled light. Small, he said. Late, local. And this is large, early, general, I said, which is another way of saying worse. He closed his eyes. Old men close their eyes not to avoid sight, but to preserve the little that looks back kindly. When he opened them, something he had been postponing stood in the room with us. You must take the ledger, he said. To whom? To the air, he said. To anyone who still thinks confession is vulgar and finds it therefore irresistible. You taught me not to steal, I said. I taught you not to tidy your thefts into virtue, he said. This is not theft. This is sedition on behalf of memory. We divided pages the way quarreling brothers divide a house. Unfairly, quickly, with the knowledge that justice is a future tense and will find us when it is ready. I took the fragments that described method, never invocation. He kept invocations. miracles of arithmetic dressed as liturgy. In the drawer only men with his age and guilt may open. He gave me the map with the 7 points and the bone stylus shaped to my palm. He did not give me the bowl. I did not ask. Before we locked the room for the last time, though we did not admit it, the choir arrived again, the maintenance that would not be dismissed by management. A low instruction, hold. A second, correct. A third, the bureaucrat's favorite, forget. And then a fourth, I had not heard before and have not heard since, except in rooms where people refuse to pretend their speech is not also a plea. Remember out loud. Do you hear it? I asked. I trained you to, he said. Go. I went. I walked the 7 points like a man tracing scars, tender, efficient, ashamed of his efficiency. I listened at the cistern and heard the city chewing a thought. I paused at the bell chamber and asked the sealed eye to forgive us our edits. The wood forgave me, because forgiving is what wood does to survive. At the ossuary, I gave the bones my shoes again and whispered a hymn into the racks until my throat learned mercy's slower tempo. The map folded in my coat warmed the way animals warm when they understand you are leaving. I will not rehearse how the ledger left the building. Escape is only interesting when men lie about it. Know this. Doors remember favors. Stairs remember knees. Guards born to paperwork can be bribed by precision when money would offend them. By dusk, paper that had been patient longer than my whole priesthood sat in a safe place that had never learned to admire safes. By night, copies existed. By morning, a witness had been created, one that could not be tuned. I returned for him. We are faithful men in strange ways. I brought bread. He did not answer the first knock, nor the second, which was normal. He hated summoning men to the door with impatience. The third knock entered a room that had been recently exited. The chair understood his weight had left. The metronome stood with its key half-turned, awaiting fingers that had decided to finish another task first. The key on the hook was gone. On the table lay the envelope with the 3 documents and a 4th thing I do not forgive him for adding. The card with the sentence I had carried in my pocket like a private weather. Non cantabit nisi cavum. On the back, in my hand not his, mine words I had never written. It will not sing unless it is hollow. So, we will refuse the hollowness they require. I am not supernatural. I do not believe in visitations that tidy the soul. I believe in handwriting and the way rooms learn it. The room had learned mine, or I had practiced, without knowing, for this sentence so long that when I finally wrote it, time refused to notice the moment. That is the kind of miracle we are left with, the ones we do not get to admire while they are happening. The rest you can speculate. A key on the wrong hook. A corridor that had learned the old man's name and then was asked politely to forget it. A city that keeps the men who keep it the way a sea keeps its own sailors, by changing the cost of breath without ceremony. I have no body to mourn. I have an absent posture to carry. You will say this is melodrama. It is not. It is general practice. Old custodians fold themselves into the material they kept. He is a correction now, distributed. When the light arrives at the amended minute, I feel him prefer accuracy over piety, and I prefer him for preferring it. If the bowl speaks to me in rooms where bowls should not be, I refuse to confess it. Instruments deserve better than my gratitude. I promised you a confession and a call. The confession you have: I helped tune a city into obedience, and then I helped it remember a little of its disobedience. I helped move a feast out of the path of a comet, and then I carried the ledger to a place where men who love days more than thrones can read it and ask better questions. I am complicit with competence. I am allergic to spectacle. I am tired of being accurate when accuracy is an alibi. Here is the call, stripped of music so you can hear it if you are walking or washing dishes or trying to sleep while history rehearses outside your window. Keep a private calendar, not of appointments, but of astonishments. Mark the day the river forgave you. Mark the hour the clock lied. Mark the minute your child asked a question you could not answer without borrowing a story that did not want to be lent. Copy maps by hand, not to own them, but to feel where your fingers hesitate. Hesitation is a cartographer's confession. Where the line fights you, go there and look with your feet. Teach children the names that fell into the margins. Saints mislaid by tidy men, midwives whose moons were moved, patrons of small fears. Let a recipe outlive an index. Listen for rooms. If the echo returns improved, ask whom the improvement serves. If a corridor corrects your voice, sing wrong on purpose once a year to keep your throat ungoverned. Do not confuse tidiness with mercy. Mercy is friction with manners. It lets memory warm its hands. When someone asks you to forget for the sake of the many, ask them to sing. If they cannot sing, they are asking you to help them tidy. And if you ever feel the hum, the low, expert, patient instruction in a room with no singers, keep the door closed. Write what you witnessed. Place the paper somewhere that does not admire locks. I have been told, by men who do not know how to confess, that a call to action must end with a promise. I have none. I have a warning, which is a better gift. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is not rebellion. It is memory returning to itself. The world is a palimpsest scraped and rewritten, but the old strokes bleed through if you hold it to the light. If you keep a bell in your house, and even a glass can be a bell, if you learn to tap it gently, let it miscount once a year without correcting it. Then write the minute down. Hand the habit to someone younger than you. Explain that silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. Then teach them how to refuse enforcement with courtesy. When you hear a harmony in a room with no choir, think first of maintenance, second of governance, third of the child you once were who believed that echo was a friend and not a policeman. Give the world back its echo. Do not make it sing your improvements. Let it sing its stubborn, inefficient, profoundly inconvenient self. This has been my confession, my ledger scratched into air, my map of a corridor under the world. What you do with it is the only correction that matters. If you must tune something, tune your hunger so that it asks for friction and not merely for ease. If you must move a feast, carry the recipe to the door of a neighbor who still remembers the name. I will go now. Doors everywhere have practiced my hand. The bowl cannot follow into rooms where a voice stays small on purpose. The choir can only instruct hollows. I will keep one empty place in my day, the old man's chair, the metronome's key, the space between a question and the breath that wants to answer it. Into that space I will pour not forgetfulness, but echo. Remember out loud, and if you need a prayer, take this one functional, unmusical, true. May your rooms refuse perfection. May your hours argue. May your memory be the wound that will not close, because it is busy singing.